everyone out there on the Palouse from the Palouse Conservation District. With the summer fully upon us and all of the trees finally put in the ground, it's the perfect time of year to revisit restoration efforts of the past and shine a spotlight on the good that they're doing. Summer is the most active time of year for living things, but there's no group of creatures that makes that point quite as obvious as birds. Birds are rather dedicated to making it known just how busy they are, both audibly and visually. This makes them particularly accessible as a group of living things to study. Especially in the summer, they're showy and fast-moving, making them pretty conspicuous. Of course, there are always exceptions to every rule, but even then, you can always count on babies to be loud. Let's discover some of the most visible birds that you're likely to see on the Palouse. We're here with a typical family of the Palouse at Stateline Wetlands, which is a portion of Paradise Creek in its floodplain at the west end of Moscow, Idaho, that's been revegetated with many native plants. While PCD does very similar work elsewhere throughout the Palouse, including another stretch of Paradise Creek at Sunshine Road, the restoration conducted at this site was managed by the Palouse Clearwater Environmental Institute. Many of the trees and bushes that you can see here were installed close to 20 years ago. Prior to that, almost everything here was covered with reed canary grass, which is a highly invasive plant in this region. If you live on the Palouse, you very well may have some growing in or near your yard. One of the most prominent concerns that PCD aims to address is the issue of erosion and soil loss on the Palouse, which is most often carried out when bare ground becomes inundated with water and gets carried out with flows. Reed canary grass takes particular advantage of such disturbed landscapes, so it's often appreciated for its ability to revegetate bare areas and provide some stability. But as you can see here, reed canary doesn't just take over at the beginning, it takes over for good and makes it nearly impossible for native plants to get a stake in the soil. In a landscape featuring a thriving native plant community, we wouldn't see any one species outcompeting the rest. Instead, we'd see plants of a wide array of sizes, shapes, colors, textures, and functions, and they'd all support living things of an equal range of characteristics. This is what we refer to as structural diversity. Imagine that same family in their home. If the adults weren't tall enough to hang up their laundry, they'd never have any dry clothes to wear. And if the kid wasn't small enough to fit into tight spaces, she wouldn't be able to find a very good spot for hide and seek. In this case, a home with much structural diversity is one where many different types of activity can occur. Likewise, an ecosystem with a great deal of structural diversity is one that can support a greater variety of living things and lifestyles than an ecosystem without much at all. We said we'd be talking about birds, so let's use birds to make our point. Like every living thing, any given species of bird will only occupy a space where it finds its suitable habitat, but a never-ending sea of reed canary grass is only suitable for a very small portion of wildlife on the Palouse. One of the few birds you may find rustling through the reed canary jungle is the California quail, who may be picking at grasshoppers, leaves, and seeds. Quail spend most of their time under cover, but you may see them roosting or hanging out in trees, especially when they have an announcement to make. Their distinctive songs are said to resemble a kazoo-like way of saying Chicago, and one of the cutest sights of the breeding season is a flock of quail chicks scurrying after their parents across a road or pathway, bobbing their heads back and forth. Another bird who frequents grassy areas is the American robin, which isn't there for the cover of the grass itself, but instead is there for the food underneath. Robins are expert worm hunters, pulling stubborn worms from the ground in an earnest and almost comical fashion, but they're equally partial to insects and their larvae too. Robins are one of our year-round resident birds of the Palouse, which means they don't migrate, and the best way to get them to stick around your place in the winter is to keep a variety of native fruit-bearing plants on your property. That makes bird watching from the warm comfort of your home that much more enjoyable. But it's still summer here, and as previously stated, birds make a lot of commotion this time of year. If we pick our eyes up off the ground, we'll see a bird that may look docile now, but was the epitome of conspicuousness as of a month ago. In the breeding season, red-winged blackbirds are found pretty much anywhere you run into standing water, where wetland plants dominate because they like to raise their young in the cattails. Although these males are tolerating each other since they're young, have all fledged and are no longer competing for resources, males of this species are some of the most aggressive of any songbird on the Palouse. That's really saying something, considering that songbirds are much bolder during the breeding season than at any other time of year, always alert and poised in fighting mode should the need arise. Birds invest a lot of energy and calories into the entire breeding process, from producing eggs, finding a place to put those eggs, and ensuring the survival of their young. Not only do eggs take a great deal of energy to make, but all that time spent guarding the nest and incubating the eggs is time spent away from the act of foraging or hunting, so making babies takes a lot of sacrifice. That's why birds are quick on the draw when it comes to defending their nests, and why you'll often witness birds responding to any intrusion with swift, noisy action, even going so far as to harass animals far bigger than they. For example, the parents of this young wren are sounding the alarm to a sudden invasion of their territory. A house wren's call sounds like an adorable scolding and is used to communicate their suspicions of disturbances in their vicinity. You'll often hear them before you see them because they're smaller and much plainer than blackbirds, benefiting instead from their tree-colored camouflaged plumage. House wrens are most at home in dense shrubbery, and they love to take over brush piles where they find heaps and heaps of insects. If you do any pruning on your property, you may want to consider leaving your waste in a pile to serve as good habitat. If you have any dead trees that don't pose a risk, you may want to consider leaving those too. That's because wrens are cavity nesters, which means they only make nests in holes, usually in trees, but sometimes in man-made structures. The good folks at PCEI installed nest boxes here at Stateline Wetlands, but most of them were actually designed for tree swallows. Tree swallows are acrobats of the air, and along with violet-green swallows, cliff swallows, and barn swallows, they roam the open skies for flying insects, taking on a good deal of mosquitoes in the act. Again, swallows tend to use, as the name suggests, natural structures like trees and cliffs as nesting sites, but they'll use man-made structures as well. Cliff and barn swallows in particular have discovered the advantages of the underside of bridges, building mud nests that cling to the walls and ceilings. Even great blue herons will use bridges as lookout sites, so man-made structures can serve as fantastic substitutes for natural ones. Moving up from the low shrubs into the tree line, we see flowering and fruiting trees play host to a plethora of birds, especially summer residents that nest here on the Palouse but leave before it gets too cold and their food runs out. Birds tend to source most of their food from insects and other invertebrates in the breeding season because they're packed with protein, which is essential for both egg production and quickly growing chicks. Male western tanagers wouldn't look as striking as they do if it weren't for the insects they eat that give them their red heads, much like the way flamingos attain their pink plumage. But when birds migrate, they tend to stock up on less flighty, more reliable sources of energy to prepare them for their journeys. That's where the abundance of native plants is necessary for ensuring the success of the continuous cycle of migration. This black-headed grosbeak is having an absolute bonanza with some newly ripened service berries. He'll continue feasting on this tree and others like it until he departs for his wintering grounds. With any luck, those serviceberry seeds will become serviceberry trees after he excretes them in his waste. This gray catbird is gathering a smorgasbord, presumably for her young, here in this native hawthorn tree. Practicing the self-restraint of not eating these tasty morsels is most likely rewarded by dining on ripening hawthorn berries, since she's no longer producing eggs. Hawthorn groves like this one behind me used to be abundant on the Palouse, but ever since the 20th century, they've been aggressively removed in order to enable access to large machinery and make farming more efficient. Hawthorn groves tend to grow very densely, and as the name suggests, they're very thorny as well, making them almost unnavigable to larger animals, which, of course, makes them ideal spaces for small animals like small mammals and small birds to seek refuge from their predators. And then, of course, hawthorn berries provide very essential sustenance for many of our birdie friends here on the Palouse. And this is just one of the many reasons why PCD is working towards restoring the native hawthorn back to its place on the Palouse. Another one of our year-round residents, the red-breasted nuthatch, can often be seen high up in the trees, but they favor conifers over fruit-bearing trees, clinging to the surface of their trunks and scouting for insects. In the winter, they'll switch over to a diet of mainly seeds. Nuthatches are frequent visitors of bird feeders, which may not be popular at the moment, as most seed-eating birds shift to a more protein-rich diet in the summer, but they'll return again if you're patient. We suggest visiting the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website about the safest and most attractive bird feed for birds in your region. Before the weather turns, we also encourage you to get out and discover the joys of birds in their natural habitats. You may even find a nest yourself. It may be too late in the season now, but in the future look for birds carrying stuff in their beaks. This may be nesting material. As we saw earlier, they may be carrying stashes of food back to their young. Another interesting behavior you may see is preening. Preening is the act of grooming that involves smoothing feathers back in place and removing dandruff and mites, and it's very flattering to see because it only happens when a bird doesn't sense any threat in you being there. If you move calmly and quietly through nature, you're much more likely to witness it. We've included here a list of publicly accessible places throughout the Palouse where filming for this video occurred and can be visited by folks like you. Happy birding, everyone!